the first drop of rain fell like a whisper against the parched earth as Nora Vaughn stared at the endless fields of dying wheat that had once promised hope. Dakota Territory, 1879. A year that had begun with so much promise now crumbled beneath the weight of the worst drought in memory, leaving her father's farm on the brink of ruin. "Your tears won't water these fields, girl," her father said, his voice harsh with desperation, as he found her kneeling in the brittle soil. "Best save your strength for what's coming." What was coming was starvation, or worse, losing the land entirely. At 21, Nora had seen enough hardship to know the difference between a passing difficult and impending disaster. This drought wasn't just taking their crops, it was stealing their future. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as Nora made her way into Cottonwood Springs, the nearest town to their struggling homestead. Her worn boots kicked up dust with each step along the main street. Men lounged outside the saloon, while women hurried about their errands, everyone moving with the listless energy that came from months of watching the sky for clouds that never appeared. "Miss Vaughn," called Mrs. Hollister from the general store's porch. "Your father settling his account this month?" Nora clutched her basket tighter. "We're waiting on the wheat, Mrs. Hollister. Just need a little more time." "Time won't help what God's abandoned," said one of the men leaning against the hitching post. "Praying's as useful as crying over it." Laughter rippled through the small gathering, cutting Nora deeper than they could know. She'd been praying every night, and yes, she'd shed tears too. Not that she'd admit it to these people who seemed to take a peculiar pleasure in others' misfortunes. "Some rain would help everyone," Nora replied evenly, lifting her chin despite the heat of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Rain won't come to land that's cursed," said another man. "That plot your pa bought from Old Man Halsey has never yielded a proper harvest." More laughter followed, but Nora kept her eyes forward as she entered the store. Inside, the shelves looked barer than they had the previous month. The drought wasn't just affecting farmers, it was strangling the entire territory. "Just flour and salt today," Nora told Mrs. Hollister, placing 2 worn coins on the counter. It was barely enough to keep them fed for the week, and they'd already sold 2 of their chickens to pay for the last round of supplies. As Mrs. Hollister measured out the flour, the bell above the door jangled. Heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor, and a hush fell over the few customers in the store. Nora didn't need to turn to know who had entered. Only one man in Cottonwood Springs commanded that kind of reaction. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hollister," came a deep voice that seemed to fill the small space. "Got any more of that coffee I bought last week?" "Just came in yesterday, Mr. Dawson," Mrs. Hollister replied, her tone notably warmer than it had been with Nora. "You're in luck." Nora kept her eyes on the counter, hoping to complete her purchase and leave without interaction. Hayes Dawson owned the largest ranch in the county, with land that stretched farther than most people could ride in a day. He'd arrived in Cottonwood Springs 3 years ago, already wealthy from cattle drives in Texas, and had bought up 3 failing farms to create his sprawling ranch. "Miss Vaughn," he said, nodding in her direction. His voice held none of the mockery she'd heard outside, but Nora stiffened nonetheless. "Mr. Dawson," she acknowledged, finally looking at him. Hayes Dawson was not what anyone would call handsome in the traditional sense. His face was too weathered, his jaw too square, his eyes too intense beneath the brim of his Stetson. But there was something compelling about him that made women especially look twice. At 32, he had the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. "How's your father's wheat coming along?" he asked, his tone conversational. "It's coming along fine," Nora lied, knowing everyone in town was aware of the Vaughn farm's struggles. Hayes's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes told her he knew she wasn't being truthful. "That's good to hear. This drought's been hard on everyone." "Some more than others," Nora couldn't help adding, thinking of his cattle with access to the creek that ran through his property water that had once flowed near enough to her father's land before Hayes had diverted it for his livestock. If he caught her meaning, he didn't show it. Instead, he simply nodded and turned his attention back to Mrs. Hollister, who was all too eager to help him with his substantial order. Nora gathered her meager purchases and headed back outside, where the group of men had grown larger. They quieted as she passed, but she heard their whispers nonetheless. "Won't last the summer. Stubborn like her pa. Dawson'll buy that land for pennies when they can't pay the taxes. Tears pricked at her eyes, but Nora refused to let them fall. Not here, not where these vultures could see and mock her further. She quickened her pace, eager to leave town behind. The walk home seemed longer than usual, the weight of their situation heavier with each step. Her father had been a proud man once, before her mother's death 5 years ago. Now he was just tired, working from dawn until dusk on fields that refused to yield. They had come to Dakota Territory with dreams of prosperity, following the government's promise that this land would provide for anyone willing to work it. No one had warned them about the droughts, the grasshoppers, or the bitter winters that could kill a man caught unprepared. When she reached the small farmhouse, her father was nowhere to be seen, probably checking the irrigation ditches again, as if willing water to appear. Nora set down her purchases and moved to the back of the house where a small garden struggled to survive. She'd been tending it diligently, using whatever kitchen water she could spare. A few hardy vegetables remained barely enough to supplement their dwindling supplies. As she knelt to pull weeds from around the withering plants, her father's shadow fell across the garden. "Town's talking," he said without preamble. "Hayes Dawson's buying up the Miller place." Nora's hands stilled. The Millers had been their neighbors for years. Their farm just beyond the rise to the east. They're leaving? Heading back to Ohio. Can't weather another season like this. Her father's voice was flat. "Makes 3 farms he's acquired this year alone. He'll come for ours next," Nora said quietly. "Not while I draw breath." There was a flash of the old fire in his eyes, but it dimmed quickly. Though that might not be as long as I'd hoped if this drought continues. Nora stood, dusting off her hands on her apron. "We'll manage, Pa. We always do." Her father looked at her with eyes that had seen too much hardship. "Your mother used to say the same thing, right up until she couldn't say anything at all." The mention of her mother stung. Consumption had taken her quickly, leaving them both adrift in a way the years hadn't fully healed. "She'd want us to keep fighting." "Fighting what, Nora? The weather? God himself?" Her father gestured to the barren fields beyond their house. "Even the Almighty's forgotten this cursed place." "Don't say that," Nora whispered. "He hasn't forgotten us." Her father's laugh was as dry as their fields. "Tell that to our wheat. Tell that to your mother's grave. Some things are beyond prayer, girl." He turned and walked away, shoulders slumped in a way that frightened Nora more than his words. She'd seen that look on other men, the ones who eventually put a gun to their heads, or walked into a blizzard without proper clothing. The look of a man who had surrendered. That night, after her father had fallen into a restless sleep, Nora slipped outside. The moon hung full and luminous in the vast Dakota sky, casting silver light over the failing farm. She walked to the edge of their property, where the wheat should have been chest-high by now, but instead barely reached her knees, thin and yellowing. Dropping to her knees, Nora pressed her palms against the parched earth and closed her eyes. "Please," she whispered, her words meant for no human ears. "I know I'm not special. I know there are others suffering just as much. But this land, this farm, it's all we have left of her, of the family we were supposed to be." The night air remained still, the silence broken only by the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. Tears slipped down Nora's cheeks, falling onto the thirsty soil beneath her hands. "I'll do anything. Work harder. Be better. Just, please don't let us lose this place." She stayed there for what felt like hours, alternating between fervent prayers and quiet tears, pouring out her heart to a God her father believed had abandoned them. When she finally rose, her dress was soiled with dust and her eyes were swollen, but something had shifted inside her. A fragile, newborn hope that refused to be extinguished, despite all evidence pointing to its futility. As she made her way back to the house, Nora didn't notice the lone rider watching from the distant rise, his silhouette dark against the moonlit sky. The next morning brought no miraculous changes. The sun rose hot and relentless, the sky remained cloudless, and Nora's father continued his silent battle against the inevitable. She didn't tell him about her midnight prayers. He would only see them as another waste, like her tears. After finishing her morning chores, Nora decided to walk to the creek that now ran exclusively through Hayes Dawson's property. Perhaps she could at least wet a cloth to cool her father's brow when he came in from the fields. The boundary between their land and Dawson's was marked by a simple fence. recently reinforced with barbed wire, a new invention that many ranchers were using to protect their claims. As Nora approached, she saw riders in the distance, Dawson's men, checking cattle from the look of it. She kept to her side of the fence, making her way toward the spot where the creek bent closest to their property line. Even from here, she could hear the water, a sound that had once been common on their own land. When she reached the creek, Nora knelt at the bank, just watching the clear water flow past. It seemed cruel that something so vital could be so close, yet inaccessible. She dipped her handkerchief into the cool stream, squeezing the excess water back before folding it carefully. "That's Dawson water you're helping yourself to." Nora startled, nearly falling into the creek. Hayes Dawson sat atop his horse just a few yards away, watching her with an unreadable expression. She hadn't heard him approach. "The creek belongs to the land," she replied, rising to her feet. "And the land belonged to everyone before men like you started claiming more than your share." A faint smile touched his lips. "Is that what you think I've done? Taken more than my share? Haven't you?" Nora challenged, emboldened by the fence between them. "3 farms this year alone. How much land does one man need?" Hayes dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby tree before approaching the fence. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard work, his broad shoulders filling out his shirt in a way that made Nora inexplicably aware of her own slight frame. "I buy land from people who want to sell," he said, stopping a respectful distance from where she stood. "I don't force anyone off their property." "You don't have to," Nora retorted. "The drought does that for you. Then you swoop in with your money and take what others have spent years building." Something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or maybe something else she couldn't quite identify. "Is that why you're here? To accuse me of being a vulture?" Nora held up her damp handkerchief. "I came for water. For my father." Hayes studied her for a long moment, his gaze so intense that Nora had to resist the urge to step back. "How is Jacob doing? I heard in town his wheat isn't faring well." "He's fine," Nora said automatically. "We're fine." "Are you?" Hayes glanced pointedly at her worn dress and the patched boots visible beneath her hem. "Because there's no shame in admitting when you need help, Miss Vaughn." "We don't need your kind of help," she snapped, though even to her own ears the words sounded hollow. "We just need rain." Hayes looked up at the cloudless sky. "That's something even my money can't buy." For a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the gentle gurgling of the creek and the occasional snort from Hayes's horse as it swished its tail against flies. "You were out here last night," Hayes said suddenly. "By the wheat fields." Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You were watching our farm?" "I was riding my property line," he corrected. "Saw you from the ridge. You were praying?" The heat in her cheeks intensified. The thought of him witnessing her vulnerable moment made her chest tighten with embarrassment. "That's none of your business, Mr. Dawson." He nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "Faith's a private thing. I respect that." His unexpected response left Nora momentarily speechless. She'd been prepared for mockery, not understanding. "I should get back," she said finally, clutching the damp handkerchief. "My father will be coming in from the field soon." Hayes reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it out to her across the fence. "Give this to Jacob. It's an offer fair and square." Nora stared at the paper, but didn't take it. "We're not selling." "Just have him look at it," Hayes insisted. "No commitment, just consideration." "I said we're not selling," Nora repeated, taking a step back. "Not now, not ever." Hayes sighed, returning the paper to his pocket. "Pride's a luxury few can afford in times like these, Miss Vaughn. Sometimes the smartest thing to do is know when to change course." "Is that what you tell yourself when you take another family's legacy? That you're doing them a favor?" The words came out sharper than she intended, fueled by years of watching neighbors and friends pack up and leave. "I tell myself I'm building something that will last," Hayes replied, his voice steady despite her accusation. "Something my children and their children can depend on." "At the expense of other people's children and their futures," Nora countered. Hayes' expression hardened slightly. "The land doesn't care who works it, Miss Vaughn. It only responds to those who understand its nature and respect its demands. Your father's a good man, but he's farming land that was never meant to grow wheat, not in this climate. not with these rainfall patterns. So we should just give up? Let you turn it into more grazing land for your cattle? You should be realistic, Hayes said, before winter comes and you have nothing to eat and nowhere to go. His words struck too close to the fears that kept Nora awake at night. She turned away, unwilling to let him see how deeply they affected her. We'll manage. We always have. The offer stands, Hayes called after her as she began walking away. When you're ready to talk sense. Nora didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on her until she crested the small rise that would take her out of sight. Only then did she allow herself to pause, closing her eyes against the hot wind that carried dust and the scent of dying vegetation. The worst part wasn't his arrogance or his presumption. It was that some small, practical part of her knew he might be right. This land had been resisting their efforts for years, despite everything they had tried. But giving up meant admitting her mother's death had been for nothing, that all their struggles had been futile. It meant surrendering the only home she'd ever known. When Nora returned to the farmhouse, her father was already inside, sitting at the table with his head in his hands. She quickly wet a cloth with some of their precious stored water and placed it on the back of his neck. "You shouldn't waste water on me," he muttered, though he didn't push the cloth away. "It's not waste if it helps you," Nora replied, moving to the stove where a thin stew simmered. It was mostly water with a few vegetables and the last of their salt pork, barely enough to sustain them, but all they could afford. "Saw you talking to Dawson," her father said after a moment. "By the creek." Nora tensed. "He was just passing by." "Did he make an offer?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I told him we weren't selling." Her father was quiet for so long that Nora thought he might have dozed off from exhaustion. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it in years. "Maybe we should hear him out." The ladle slipped from Nora's fingers, clattering against the stove. "Pa, no, this is our home. It's land, Nora, just land. And it's killing me by inches." He straightened, revealing a face etched with lines that hadn't been there even a month ago. "I promised your mother I'd take care of you, and all I've done is drag you deeper into poverty." "We're not poor," Nora insisted. "We're just waiting for things to turn around." "Been waiting 5 years, he said with a bitter laugh. "How much longer should we wait? Until we're both in the ground?" Nora moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his work-roughened hands in hers. "The rain will come, Pa. I know it will." "You sound just like her," he whispered, and for a moment Nora thought she saw tears in his eyes before he blinked them away. "Always believing the best is just around the corner." "Because it is," Nora insisted. "We just have to hold on a little longer." Her father pulled one hand free and gently touched her cheek. "I've held on as long as I can, daughter. I'm tired, bone tired. Dawson's right. This land wasn't meant for wheat. We've been fighting nature itself, and nature always wins in the end." Nora felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. Her father had always been the stubborn one, insisting they could make the farm work despite all evidence to the contrary. To hear him surrender now was more frightening than any drought or winter storm. "Give me until the end of summer," she pleaded. "If there's no rain by then, we can talk to Mr. Dawson." He studied her face for a long moment before sighing. "End of summer. But if conditions worsen before then, we sell." "I won't risk starvation out of pride." It was the best compromise Nora could hope for. "Thank you, Pa." As they ate their meager supper, Nora couldn't help wondering what Hayes Dawson's offer had been. Enough to start over somewhere else, enough to live comfortably for a while, or just enough to get them out of his way. That night, after her father had gone to bed, Nora returned to the wheat fields. The moon was hidden behind clouds tonight, not rain clouds, just the thin, wispy kind that teased with their presence but delivered nothing of value. She knelt in the same spot as the night before, pressing her hands against the earth. This time, her prayers were more desperate, more specific. "Please send rain," she whispered. "Not for me, not even for Pa, but for this land that deserves a chance to show what it can do." 3 months, that's all I'm asking for. Enough time to bring in a harvest that will let us stay. The wind picked up, rustling the stunted wheat. Nora closed her eyes, imagining it was the breath of God responding to her plea. Tears slipped down her cheeks again, falling onto the soil as they had the night before, small offerings to a parched earth that seemed determined to reject all their efforts. "I believe," she said into the darkness. Even when no one else does, I still believe. From his vantage point on the ridge, Hayes Dawson watched the distant figure kneeling in the wheat field. 2 nights in a row, she'd gone out there, this stubborn woman with her prayers and her tears. Something about her determination stirred something in him, respect, perhaps. Or maybe a recognition of the same tenacity that had driven him to build his ranch from nothing. He'd meant what he'd said about his offer being fair. Jacob Vaughn's 160 acres weren't worth much in their current state, but they connected 2 portions of Hayes's property in a way that would make managing his cattle more efficient. He'd pay well above market value enough for the Vaughns to start fresh somewhere more suited to farming, but watching Nora kneel in that dying field, Hayes felt an unfamiliar twinge of doubt. Not about his business decision, but about the impact it would have on this woman, whose faith seemed unshakable despite all evidence pointing to its futility. Hayes wasn't a religious man in the traditional sense. He believed more in sweat and strategy than in divine intervention. Yet there was something almost holy about the scene before him, something that made him hesitate to intrude, even from this distance. After a few minutes, he turned his horse and rode back toward his ranch house, thoughts churning like an approaching storm. The next day brought a surprise visitor to the Vaughn farm. Nora was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Shading her eyes against the sun, she watched as Hayes Dawson himself pulled up in front of their house, a team of strong horses drawing a wagon loaded with wooden barrels. Her father emerged from the barn, looking as puzzled as Nora felt. "Dawson," he acknowledged, approaching the wagon cautiously. "Something we can do for you?" Hayes tipped his hat to both of them. "Thought you might be able to use some water. Creek's running strong on my property, and I figured your well might be getting low." Nora stared in disbelief. Their well was indeed dangerously low. They'd been rationing water for weeks, prioritizing their few remaining animals over their own comfort. "Why would you do this?" her father asked, suspicion evident in his voice. Hayes shrugged, as if delivering barrels of precious water was a casual neighborly gesture. "Drought's hard on everyone, just doing what anyone would." "But not everyone is," Nora pointed out, moving closer to the wagon. There were at least 6 large barrels, enough to sustain them and their animals for 2 weeks or more. Hayes met her gaze steadily. "No, they're not. That's their choice." Her father circled the wagon, examining the barrels. "Is this some kind of bribe, Dawson? Water in exchange for my land?" "It's water in exchange for nothing," Hayes replied firmly. "Take it or leave it, but don't insult me by suggesting I'd use something as vital as water to manipulate you." Something in his tone must have convinced her father, because after a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "We'll take it, and we're obliged for the kindness." "I'll help you unload," Hayes said, already climbing down from the wagon seat. For the next hour, the 3 of them worked together to position the barrels near the house and barn. Despite his status as the wealthiest rancher in the county, Hayes worked alongside them without complaint, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle from years of physical labor. Nora found herself watching him when he wasn't looking the way he moved with purposeful efficiency. The respectful way he spoke to her father as they discussed the best placement for the water barrels, the occasional smile that transformed his weathered face into something unexpectedly handsome. When the last barrel was in place, her father insisted Hayes stay for lunch. "It's not much," he warned, "but we can spare some stew and bread." Hayes looked like he might refuse, but then his eyes met Nora's. "I'd be honored," he said after a moment. Inside the small farmhouse, Nora busied herself setting an extra place at the table while her father washed up outside. When Hayes entered, he removed his hat respectfully, looking around the modest home with interest rather than judgment. "Your mother?" he asked, nodding toward a faded photograph on the mantel. Nora glanced at the image of a woman whose face mirrored her own. "Yes. She passed 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Hayes said, and there was a genuine quality to his sympathy that surprised her. "Losing a parent changes everything." "You speak from experience?" Nora asked, bringing a pot of reheated stew to the table. Hayes nodded. "Lost both mine in a fire when I was 17. Had to make my own way after that." The revelation made Nora see him differently, not as the ruthless land grabber she'd imagined, but as someone who understood loss. "Is that when you came west?" "A few years later," he said, taking the seat she indicated. "Worked cattle drives in Texas, saved every penny. Bought my first piece of land when I was 24. Her father joined them, and the conversation shifted to more general topics: the weather, news from town, predictions about the coming winter. Throughout the meal, Nora noticed Hayes taking only small portions, leaving more for them, despite what must have been a hearty appetite for a man his size. When they'd finished, her father excused himself to check on their remaining livestock, leaving Nora alone with Hayes at the table. "Thank you," she said after an awkward silence, "for the water. It will make a difference." Hayes studied her across the table. "But not enough of a difference." "What do you mean?" "You need rain, Nora, not barrels of water." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something about the way he said it made her pulse quicken slightly. "Your wheat fields need inches of rainfall, not buckets carried by hand." "I know that," she said quietly. "Then why refuse a reasonable offer for land that's fighting you at every turn?" Hayes leaned forward, his expression earnest. "There's no shame in recognizing when a battle can't be won." "This isn't about shame," Nora insisted. "It's about faith." "Faith in what? That God will suddenly change the weather patterns that have governed this region for centuries?" Nora met his gaze steadily. "Faith that perseverance matters, that giving up is never the right answer." Hayes sat back, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're either the most stubborn or the most faithful woman I've ever met. Maybe both." "I prefer determined," Nora replied with a hint of her own smile. "Determined, then." Hayes stood, reaching for his hat. "I should get back. Got cattle to move to the north pasture before sundown." Nora rose as well, walking him to the door. "The offer still stands? Until the end of summer?" Hayes paused at the threshold, turning to face her. "It does. Though I'm starting to think you'll find a way to make this farm work, despite everything." "Is that a compliment, Mr. Dawson?" "An observation, Miss Vaughn." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than was strictly proper. "And you can call me Hayes. We're neighbors, after all." "Neighbors with a fence between them," Nora reminded him. "Fences can come down as easily as they go up," Hayes replied. "Something to consider." With that cryptic remark, he settled his hat on his head and departed, leaving Nora wondering what exactly he'd meant, and why the thought of seeing him again caused such a confusing mixture of anticipation and wariness. The next week brought no change in the weather. But it did bring another wagon of water barrels from Hayes Dawson's ranch. This time, he sent 2 of his ranch hands to deliver them, with a note for Jacob Vaughn explaining that he was away on business in Rapid City. Nora tried to ignore the disappointment she felt at his absence. It made no sense to miss the presence of a man who ultimately wanted to buy their land out from under them, no matter how courteous he'd been, or how much they needed the water he provided. Yet, as she helped her father empty the barrels into their storage containers, she found herself wondering when Hayes would return, what business had taken him to Rapid City, and whether he was thinking about their conversation. 3 days later, Nora was working in what remained of their garden when she heard the now familiar sound of Hayes's wagon approaching. Setting aside her tools, she straightened her dress and smoothed back her hair before catching herself. Why should she care how she looked for Hayes Dawson? But she did care, and that realization bothered her almost as much as the continued drought. "Afternoon, Miss Vaughn," Hayes called as he brought the wagon to a stop. Today he wore a clean white shirt and his best Stetson, as if he'd made an effort with his appearance as well. "Your father around?" "He's repairing the barn roof," Nora replied, approaching the wagon. To her surprise, it contained no water barrels today, but rather several large crates and a peculiar piece of equipment she didn't recognize. "What's all this?" Hayes jumped down from the wagon seat. "Something I picked up in Rapid City. Thought it might help your situation." Jacob Vaughn appeared from around the side of the barn, tools in hand. "Dawson, another delivery?" "Of sorts," Hayes said, gesturing to the wagon. "Ever heard of dry farming techniques? They're using them successfully in parts of California and Colorado, with similar rainfall patterns to ours." Nora's father approached cautiously. "Heard some talk. Never seen it implemented." "This equipment is designed specifically for it," Hayes explained, patting one of the crates. "Special plow that cuts deeper and creates a dust mulch that preserves soil moisture. Drought-resistant wheat seed, too, developed by farmers who've been dealing with these conditions for years." Nora stared at him in confusion. "You brought us farming equipment? Why would you do that if you want to buy our land?" Hayes met her gaze steadily. I want to buy land from people who want to sell, not from those forced into it by circumstances beyond their control. So this is, what, a challenge? Her father asked, though there was more curiosity than suspicion in his tone now. Call it a fair chance, Hayes replied. If it works, you keep your farm and I find other land to expand my ranch. If it doesn't, he shrugged. My offer still stands, and at least you'll know you tried everything possible. Nora couldn't make sense of it. Everything she'd heard about Hayes Dawson suggested he was a shrewd businessman who never made a move that didn't benefit him directly. Yet here he was, potentially sabotaging his own plans to acquire their land. Why? She asked simply. Hayes glanced at her father, then back to her. May I speak with you privately, Miss Vaughn? Her father raised an eyebrow, but nodded. I'll start unloading these crates. Take your time. As her father began examining the equipment, Hayes gestured toward the edge of the property. Walk with me? Nora hesitated only briefly before falling into step beside him. They walked in silence until they reached the fence line that separated their properties, the same spot where they'd spoken by the creek days earlier. Hayes stopped, gazing out over the parched landscape. I saw you praying, he said finally, that night in the wheat field, and the night after. Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks. You were watching me. Not intentionally, he assured her. I was riding my property line, checking for strays. But yes, I saw you. Saw your tears, too. The embarrassment deepened. And you thought it was foolish, like everyone else in town. No, Hayes said quietly. I thought it was the bravest thing I've seen in a long time. Faith when everything around you suggests it's hopeless. That takes courage I'm not sure I possess. Nora looked at him in surprise. You don't seem like a man who lacks courage, Mr. Dawson. Hayes, he corrected gently. And physical courage is different, facing down a stampede or a gunslinger that's instinct and training. But what you have, that's something rarer. What I have hasn't brought rain, Nora pointed out. Not yet, Hayes agreed. But it made me think about what I've been doing here, buying up farms from desperate people because I have the means to wait out the drought while they don't. He shook his head. There's nothing illegal about it, but watching you pray for this land made me wonder if there was a better way. So you brought us farming equipment instead of making another offer on our land? I brought you a fighting chance, Hayes said, because that's what everyone deserves, especially someone with your kind of faith. Nora studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but found only sincerity in his expression. And if it works, if we manage to bring in a harvest despite the drought, a smile touched Hayes's lips, then I'll have to find another way to expand my ranch, and I'll have made a friend instead of acquired a property. Seems like a fair trade to me. Something shifted in Nora's perception of Hayes Dawson in that moment, a fundamental realignment that made her see him not as an adversary, but as a man of unexpected depth and principle. Thank you, she said simply, the words inadequate for what she felt. Don't thank me yet, Hayes cautioned. That equipment isn't magic. It'll still take hard work and some luck with the weather. And prayer, Nora added. Hayes nodded. And prayer. Though I admit, that part I'll leave to you. Been a long time since I had a conversation with the Almighty. It's never too late to start again, Nora said softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Nora felt as if something unspoken passed between them, a connection that transcended their differences, and the fence that separated their lands. The moment was broken by her father calling from the farmyard. Nora, come see this contraption Dawson's brought. We should get back, Nora said, suddenly self-conscious. Hayes nodded, but as they turned to walk back, he said, I meant what I said about fences, Nora. They can come down as easily as they go up. This time, she understood his meaning perfectly. The following weeks brought significant changes to the Vaughn farm. With Hayes's guidance, they implemented the dry farming techniques, plowing deeper furrows that preserved what little moisture remained in the soil, and planting the drought-resistant wheat in carefully spaced rows. It was back-breaking work, especially for two people, but Hayes often sent one or two of his ranch hands to help, and sometimes came himself. Each time he visited, Nora found herself looking forward to their conversations. Hayes was well-read, despite his lack of formal education, and their discussions ranged from farming techniques to literature to the future of the Dakota Territory. He listened to her opinions with genuine interest, never dismissing her ideas because of her gender or youth. More surprising was the change in her father. The new techniques and equipment had given him renewed purpose. He still checked the sky daily for clouds, but the desperate resignation that had haunted his eyes for months had diminished. He and Hayes developed an unlikely friendship, built on mutual respect and a shared love for the land, albeit in different forms. Yet, the drought persisted. June turned to July with barely a sprinkle of rain. The new wheat struggled, though it fared better than their previous crop had. Nora continued her nightly prayers, though now she did them from the porch rather than kneeling in the fields, aware that Hayes might be watching from the ridge. One evening in mid-July, Hayes arrived just before sunset with another load of water. As they unloaded the barrels together, Nora noticed dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. "Think it might rain?" she asked, trying to keep the hope from her voice. They'd seen promising clouds before, only to watch them dissipate or pass by without releasing a single drop. Hayes studied the sky with a practiced eye. "Hard to say. Those clouds have some weight to them, but the wind might push them north of us." Her father joined them, wiping his hands on a rag. "Dinner's almost ready, Dawson. You're welcome to stay." These invitations had become routine, and Hayes usually accepted when his ranch duties allowed. Tonight, he glanced again at the approaching clouds. "Think I'd better get back before that weather hits, whatever it brings. Still have cattle in the south pasture that might need moving if it turns nasty." Nora couldn't hide her disappointment. "Another time, then." "Count on it," Hayes replied with a smile that seemed meant just for her. "I'll stop by tomorrow to check on how that new seed is developing." After he departed, Nora and her father finished securing the water barrels and retreated to the house as the wind began to pick up. Throughout dinner, Nora found herself glancing repeatedly at the window, watching as the clouds rolled closer, dark and heavy with promise. "Don't get your hopes up," her father cautioned, noticing her distraction. "Storm might miss us entirely." "Or it might not," Nora replied. "Either way, I'm grateful for today." Her father gave her a knowing look. "Grateful for the water? Or for Dawson's company?" Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Both, I suppose. He's a good man," her father said after a moment. "Better than I gave him credit for initially." "Yes," Nora agreed softly. "He is. And he looks at you the way I used to look at your mother." Nora's eyes widened. "Pa, he does not." Her father chuckled. "I may be getting old, but my eyesight's still good enough to see what's right in front of me. Question is, how do you feel about him?" Before Nora could formulate a response, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed seconds later by a deafening crack of thunder. They both jumped to their feet and rushed to the window. The storm had arrived. For a moment, they just stared at the darkened landscape, illuminated periodically by flashes of lightning. Then, with a sound like thousands of pebbles hitting the roof simultaneously, the rain began to fall. Not a sprinkle, not a passing shower. Real rain, heavy, drenching, glorious rain that immediately began forming puddles in the yard. "My God," her father whispered, "it's actually raining." Nora couldn't speak. Tears filled her eyes as she watched water cascading from the roof in sheets, soaking into the parched earth that had been waiting so long for this moment. Without thinking, she ran to the door and flung it open, stepping out onto the porch. The rain was coming down so hard that she was instantly drenched, her dress clinging to her body and her hair plastered to her face. But she didn't care. Laughing, she extended her arms and tilted her face toward the sky, letting the rain wash away months of worry and fear. "Nora, you'll catch your death," her father called, but there was laughter in his voice too. "It's raining, Pa," she shouted back, spinning in a circle like she had as a child. "It's really raining." Her father joined her on the porch, more cautious but just as moved by the downpour. He put an arm around her shoulders, and together they watched as the drought-stricken land drank in the blessing that had finally arrived. The storm continued through the night, alternating between gentle showers and powerful downpours. By morning, the transformation was astonishing. Puddles and small streams had formed where only dust had been the day before. The wheat fields, though still struggling, seemed to stand taller, as if the plants had stretched toward the moisture during the night. Nora rose early, eager to see the full extent of the rainfall's impact. As she stepped outside, she was surprised to find Hayes Dawson riding up to their farm, his clothes and hat soaked despite the rain having tapered off to a gentle drizzle. "Hayes!" she called, hurrying toward him as he dismounted. "Can you believe it? It finally rained." His smile was as bright as she'd ever seen it. "Heaviest rainfall in 2 years, according to my measurements. Creeks running higher, too." "Did you ride all the way from your ranch in this weather just to tell us that?" Nora asked, suddenly aware that she'd used his first name without thinking. Hayes's expression grew more serious. "No, I came to make sure you and your father were all right. Storm did some damage on my property. Lightning struck one of the outbuildings. Wanted to be sure your place was spared." The concern in his voice touched her deeply. "We're fine. Better than fine, actually." "I can see that," Hayes said softly, and Nora realized he wasn't looking at the rain-soaked farm, but at her. Despite her damp hair and simple morning dress, he was gazing at her as if she were the most beautiful sight he'd ever beheld. Her father emerged from the barn, his face breaking into a smile when he saw their visitor. "Dawson, come to see what a miracle looks like?" Hayes finally tore his gaze from Nora to greet her father. "Came to check on you both, actually. Glad to see you weathered the storm well." "Better than well," her father replied enthusiastically. "Come look at the wheat field, already showing signs of revival." As her father led Hayes toward the fields, Nora hung back, watching them go with a curious mixture of emotions. Relief at the rainfall, certainly. Hope for their crops. But also something else, a warmth that spread through her chest whenever Hayes looked at her the way he had moments ago. Was her father right? Did Hayes Dawson feel something for her beyond neighborly concern? And if he did, what did that mean for their future? He was still a cattle rancher, and she was still a farmer's daughter. Their ways of life were fundamentally different, even opposed in some respects. Yet as she watched Hayes listening attentively to her father's excited explanations about the wheat, Nora wondered if perhaps those differences mattered less than she'd once believed. After all, fences could come down as easily as they went up. The rain continued intermittently for 3 days, blessing the parched land with enough moisture to transform the landscape. Streams that had been dry for months began flowing again. The wheat, though it wouldn't yield a full harvest, showed remarkable recovery. Even the garden behind the house perked up, the vegetables growing visibly larger with each passing day. News traveled fast in Cottonwood Springs. By the end of the week, Nora had to venture into town for supplies, knowing she would face the same people who had mocked her tears and dismissed her prayers just weeks before. The change in attitude was immediate and striking. Where once there had been derision, now there was something approaching respect, or at least curiosity. "Heard your wheat's coming back," Mrs. Hollister said, as she measured out flour for Nora. "Must be that special seed Dawson brought you." "The seed helped," Nora acknowledged. "But I think the rain had something to do with it, too." Mrs. Hollister nodded thoughtfully. "Funny how it came right after you needed it most, almost like someone was listening to those prayers of yours." Before Nora could respond, the bell above the door jangled and several men entered, including those who had been most vocal in their mockery of her faith. "Miss Vaughn," one of them said, tipping his hat with unexpected courtesy. "Your father's wheat looking better these days?" "Much better, thank you," Nora replied politely. The man shifted uncomfortably. "Well, that's good to hear." "Real good." Another man cleared his throat. "Some of us was wondering if you might put in a good word with whoever you've been talking to up there. Johnson's corn could use some attention next." There was nervous laughter, but Nora realized the request, though framed as a joke, held a kernel of genuine hope. These hardened men, who had scoffed at her tears and prayers, were now half-seriously asking for her intercession. "I don't have any special connection," Nora said gently. "I just believe that faith matters, even when there's no evidence to support it." "Well, there's evidence now," Mrs. Hollister pointed out, gesturing toward the window where puddles still dotted the street. "Rain came right when you needed it most." As Nora gathered her purchases and prepared to leave, she felt a shift in how the townspeople regarded her, not with mockery, but with a newfound respect that made her both uncomfortable and oddly satisfied. Outside the general store, she was surprised to find Hayes waiting beside his wagon. He was dressed more formally than usual, in a clean black coat over a crisp white shirt. "Hayes," she greeted him, unable to hide her pleasure at seeing him. "What brings you to town?" "Banking business," he replied, taking her packages and helping her onto the wagon seat. "Thought I might offer you a ride back to your farm if our paths aligned." "That's very kind," Nora said, settling beside him, "though I'm perfectly capable of walking." "Never doubted it," Hayes said with a smile as he flicked the reins and set the horses in motion. "But I had a proposition I wanted to discuss with you. Figured the ride would give us time to talk." Nora's heart skipped a beat, though she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of proposition?" Hayes guided the wagon through town before answering. Once they were on the open road, he said, "I've been thinking about our situations, your farm, my ranch, the difficulties and opportunities of each. And," Nora prompted when he paused, "and I'm wondering if there's a way for us both to benefit from working together rather than separately." Hayes glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "My cattle need grazing land. Your wheat needs consistent water. The creek that runs through my property could be redirected to benefit your fields without harming my livestock." Nora considered his words carefully. "You're suggesting some kind of partnership?" "In a manner of speaking." Hayes's hands tightened slightly on the reins, though perhaps not just in business matters. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. "Hayes," Nora began, her voice softer than she intended, "are you courting me?" He drew the wagon to a stop at the side of the road, turning to face her directly. "I'm trying to, though apparently not very skillfully if you have to ask." Despite her nervousness, Nora couldn't help smiling. "Most courtships don't begin with business propositions about water rights." "Most courtships don't involve a woman who preys in wheat fields and a man who buys farms for a living," Hayes countered, a hint of humor in his eyes. "We're hardly conventional, Nora." "No," she agreed. "We're not." Hayes took a deep breath. "The truth is, I admire you. Your faith, your determination, your love for this land, even when it seems determined to break your heart. I came to Dakota Territory to build something lasting, something meaningful. I thought that meant acres and cattle and barns. But lately I've been thinking it might mean something else entirely." Nora's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "And what might that be?" "A partnership of equals," Hayes said simply. "A shared life with someone who challenges me to be better than I am. Someone who sees beyond what's visible to what's possible." "Someone like me?" Nora asked, barely above a whisper. "Not someone like you, Nora. You." Hayes reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm not asking for an answer today. Just permission to call on you properly, to see if what I feel, what I hope you might come to feel, could grow into something worth building a life around." Nora looked down at their joined hands, then back at his face, earnest, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. This was Hayes Dawson, without his usual confidence, laying bare his hopes and fears for her judgment. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like that very much." The smile that broke across Hayes's face was like the sun emerging from behind storm clouds, bright, warming, transforming. "Yeah? Yes," Nora confirmed, her own smile growing. "Though my father might have some conditions." Hayes laughed, the tension leaving his shoulders. "I suspect he's already guessed my intentions. Man's more observant than he lets on." "He is at that," Nora agreed. Hayes squeezed her hand once before releasing it and taking up the reins again. As they continued toward her farm, Nora felt as if the landscape itself had changed, not just from the rain, but from the possibility that had opened before them. The future, which had seemed so constrained just weeks ago, now stretched wide with promise. The summer passed in a whirl of activity and emotion. The wheat, while not producing a bumper crop, yielded enough to keep the Vaughns solvent for another year. Hayes's courtship progressed with a deliberateness that spoke to his serious intentions, each visit bringing them closer as they discovered shared dreams and complementary strengths. True to his word, Hayes worked with Jacob Vaughn to redirect a portion of the creek's flow to benefit the wheat fields, using irrigation techniques he'd learned about during his travels. The arrangement marked the beginning of what both men hoped would be a productive partnership. By late August, when Hayes formally asked Jacob for permission to marry Nora, the answer was a gruff but affectionate, About time you got around to asking. The wedding took place in early October, after the harvest was in and before the winter weather made travel difficult. The whole town turned out, including those who had once mocked Nora's faith. Mrs. Hollister herself baked the wedding cake, declaring it was the least she could do for the girl whose prayers saved us all from ruin. Nora wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame. Hayes, unrecognizable in a new suit ordered from Chicago, waited for her at the front of the small church with an expression of wonder that made Nora's heart swell with love. Their vows were simple but profound promises to support each other through drought and plenty, to build something lasting together, to nurture the faith that had brought them to this moment. As they emerged from the church as husband and wife, Nora was startled to see rows of saplings lining the path to the waiting wagon, tiny cottonwood trees barely taller than fence posts. "What's all this?" she asked Hayes, who was grinning like a boy with a secret. "Our future," he replied. "One tree for each of our neighbors. They're to be planted along the creek that now connects our properties rather than divides them. In time, they'll grow tall enough to provide shade and shelter. Maybe even help draw more rain." Nora looked at the gathered townspeople, many of whom held their own saplings. "This was your idea." "Mine and your father's," Hayes admitted. "Though once word got out, everyone wanted to contribute. Seems your faith inspired more people than you realized." Tears filled Nora's eyes, not tears of desperation or fear, but of overwhelming gratitude. She had once knelt alone in a failing wheat field, praying for rain that seemed impossible. Now she stood surrounded by a community united in hope, married to a man who had once been her adversary, but had become her greatest advocate. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to Hayes, the townspeople, or God himself, she couldn't have said. Perhaps all three. Hayes squeezed her hand. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Dawson?" Home. Not just the farmhouse where she'd grown up, or the ranch house where Hayes lived, but something new they would create together, a place where both cattle and wheat could thrive, where fences marked boundaries but didn't divide hearts. "I'm ready," Nora replied, and knew it was true in every sense that mattered. As Hayes helped her into the wagon, decorated with wildflowers and ribbons by the town's children, someone called out, "Speech from the groom." Hayes looked momentarily flustered, but then smiled and addressed the gathered crowd. "I don't have much to say except, thank you all for coming, and maybe this, that sometimes the things we think we want aren't what we need at all. I came to Dakota Territory looking for land and ended up finding something far more valuable." His gaze returned to Nora, full of love and promise. "I found someone who taught me that faith isn't about what you can see, but about what you can imagine. Someone who wasn't afraid to kneel in a dying field and pray for rain when everyone else had given up." The crowd murmured their approval, and Hayes concluded, "So if your barns are empty or your fields are failing, don't lose hope, and maybe say a prayer. You never know who might be listening." With that, he flicked the reins, and the wagon began moving toward their future together. 1 year later, Nora stood at the edge of the wheat field, now lush and golden in the autumn sun. The drought had broken completely the previous spring, bringing steady rainfall that transformed the landscape. The cottonwood saplings along the creek had taken root and grown surprisingly fast, their silver-green leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Hayes approached from behind, wrapping his arms around her expanding waistline. At 7 months pregnant, Nora had finally conceded to reducing her farm duties, though she still insisted on checking the wheat daily. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured, resting his chin on her shoulder. "More than I ever imagined possible," Nora agreed, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Sometimes, I still can't believe it." Their first year of marriage had brought challenges, certainly. Merging two different operations, his cattle ranch and her wheat farm, had required compromise and creativity from both of them. There had been arguments about priorities and methods, moments of frustration when their different approaches collided, but there had also been unexpected joys. Hayes's natural business acumen, combined with Nora's intimate knowledge of farming, had resulted in innovations that benefited both endeavors. The irrigation system they had developed was being adopted by other farms in the region. Their barns were full with cattle, wheat, and the tools of their shared trade. Most importantly, they had built a life together that honored both their pasts while creating something entirely new. Nora's father had moved into a comfortable cabin on their property, close enough for daily visits but separate enough to give the young couple privacy. He'd taken on the role of advisor and mentor to the ranch hands Hayes employed, passing on decades of hard-won wisdom about the land and its seasons. "Your father says we'll have snow before the month is out," Hayes said, his hand caressing the swell of their child. "Says he can feel it in his bones." "He's usually right about these things," Nora acknowledged. "We should finish bringing in the last of the harvest this week." "Already arranged," Hayes assured her. "Johnson and Miller are sending their boys over tomorrow to help. We'll be done by Thursday at the latest." Nora turned in his arms, her expression suddenly serious. "Do you ever regret it? Changing your plans for the ranch? Taking on wheat farming when cattle was your expertise?" Hayes studied her face, still amazed that this strong, faithful woman had agreed to share his life. "Not for a single moment. The ranch is thriving, Nora. The wheat is thriving. We're thriving." His hand returned to her belly. "All of us." "Even when I insist on doing things my way?" she teased, though there was a genuine question beneath the light tone. "Especially then," Hayes replied with a smile. "Your way usually turns out to be right, much as it pains me to admit it." Nora laughed, the sound carrying across the golden field. "I'll remind you of that the next time we disagree about crop rotation." They began walking back toward the house, arms around each other, moving at the slower pace Nora's condition necessitated. As they crested the small rise that offered a view of their combined property, they paused to take in the sight. What had once been separate homesteads divided by fences and water rights disputes was now a harmonious whole. The ranch house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. New barns stood filled with the season's bounty. The creek flowed strong and steady, nourishing both wheat fields and grazing land through the irrigation system they had designed together. "I never thought I'd say this," Nora admitted, "but I'm actually grateful for that drought." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Grateful for something that nearly destroyed your farm? If not for the drought, you wouldn't have been buying up failing farms. I wouldn't have needed to pray in that wheat field. You wouldn't have seen me and had your change of heart." Nora smiled up at him. "Sometimes the hardest seasons bring the greatest blessings." "Speaking of blessings," Hayes said, his expression growing more serious, "I've been thinking about names for the little one." Nora rested her hands on her belly. "Have you now? And what names has the great Hayes Dawson deemed worthy of consideration?" "If it's a girl," Hayes said softly, "I thought maybe Grace." "Grace," Nora repeated, testing the name. "For my grandmother?" "For your grandmother," Hayes agreed, "and for the grace that brought us together against all odds." Tears welled in Nora's eyes, the happy kind that she no longer tried to hide. "It's perfect. And if it's a boy?" Hayes smiled. "I thought we might name him Jacob, after your father. A good, strong name for a boy who will grow up knowing both cattle and wheat." "Jacob Dawson," Nora nodded. "Pa would be honored, though he'd probably insist he doesn't deserve it." "All the more reason to do it," Hayes replied. "The man who raised you deserves to have his name carried forward." They continued toward the house, discussing the upcoming winter and their plans for the following spring. As they reached the porch, Hayes paused, drawing Nora close for a gentle kiss. "What was that for?" she asked, pleasantly surprised. "Just grateful," he said simply. "For you, for us, for everything that led us here, even the parts that seemed like disasters at the time." Nora stood on tiptoe to return his kiss. "Me too, though I still maintain that redirecting that creek was my idea first." Hayes laughed, the sound rich with happiness. "Whatever you say, Mrs. Dawson, whatever you say." As they entered their home together, the setting sun cast long shadows across fields that had once been barren, but now promised sustenance for years to come. The barns stood full, the house was warm, and the future stretched before them, a future built on faith, perseverance, and the love that had grown between a stubborn farmer's daughter and the cattle rancher who had learned to see beyond fences. They had weathered the drought together, and whatever seasons came next, harsh winters, spring floods, summer heat, or autumn abundance, they would face them side by side, their roots as deeply intertwined as the cottonwood trees growing strong along the creek that now united rather than divided their land. In Cottonwood Springs, people still told the story of Nora Vaughn Dawson and her prayers for rain, how she had knelt in failing fields while others mocked her tears, how the heavens had finally opened and the land had flourished once more. Some called it coincidence, others a miracle. But those who knew Nora and Hayes best understood it was something else entirely, a testament to the power of faith. Not just in God or the weather, but in the possibility that even the deepest droughts can end, that barren fields can yield abundance, and that love can grow in the most unlikely soil when given water, time, and unwavering belief.